Mason Sisk is what you're afraid of. And when your children get up in the middle of the night and they're scared because they think there's a monster in their closet, or they get up in the middle of the night and they're scared because they think there's a monster under their bed, well, Mason Sisk was that monster. He was that monster in that basement who killed those children.
A 14-year-old boy called 911 to report gunshots inside his own house. When deputies arrived, he was standing in the driveway. Inside, 5 members of his family were dead. Before the night was over, that same boy would admit that he was the one who pulled the trigger. This is cold justice. Today we're examining one of the most closely watched juvenile prosecutions in the history of Alabama. A case that took nearly 4 years, 2 full trials, a multi-year digital forensics effort, and a state appeal to reach its conclusion. No dramatization, no embellishment, just the documented record, the investigation, the forensic evidence, the courtroom testimony, and the legal reasoning that decided this case. If you value cases built entirely on verified public record, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment before we begin. Now, let's go back to Labor Day weekend, 2019, in the small town of Elkmont, Alabama. Elkmont is a small community in Limestone County, in the northern part of Alabama, with a population of only a few thousand people. It's the kind of town where law enforcement calls are rare and violent crime rarer still. On Ridge Road, in a modest family home, lived John Wayne Sisk, age 38, and his wife, Mary Sisk, age 35. John had raised his teenage son, Mason, largely on his own, after Mason's biological mother was no longer a consistent presence in his life. When John married Mary, she became, for all practical purposes, the only mother figure the boy had known through most of his upbringing. John and Mary had 3 young children together. The oldest was 6 years old. The second was 4 years old. The youngest was an infant of 6 months. Including 14-year-old Mason, 7 people lived under that roof. Neighbors and relatives who later gave statements to investigators and to local media described the household as a typical working-class family in a rural community. Nothing that stood out, no prior police involvement at the residence, no red flags visible from the outside. That description would soon be tested against a very different reality. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, on Labor Day weekend of 2019, a 911 call came in from the Sisk residence. The caller was 14-year-old Mason Sisk. He told the dispatcher he had heard gunshots inside the home. Limestone County Sheriff's Office deputies, along with members of the local volunteer fire department, were dispatched immediately. According to testimony later presented at trial, when deputies arrived at the property, Mason was not inside the home. He met them outside, in the driveway. When officers entered the residence, they found that all 5 other occupants, John Sisk, Mary Sisk, and their 3 children, had died from gunshot wounds. Autopsy testimony later confirmed that each of the 5 victims had sustained gunshot injuries to the head. In keeping with this channel's editorial standards for cases involving children, we will not describe further physical detail. The 2 youngest victims will be identified only by age and outcome. The 6-year-old child died. The 4-year-old child died. The 6-month-old infant died. Body camera footage from the responding deputies was later entered into evidence and shown to the jury. According to testimony from those first responders, the earliest moments of the response were difficult to interpret. Investigators had to work quickly to determine what had happened and whether anyone at the scene posed an ongoing threat. In the hours that followed, investigators turned their attention to the one person who had been in the home and had survived, Mason Sisk. The first deputy on scene later testified that Mason's behavior struck him as unusual enough to note in his official report. Combined with early inconsistencies in Mason's account of the night, that observation prompted investigators to shift quickly from treating him as a witness to treating him as a person of interest. Mason's initial statement was that he had been in the basement playing video games when he heard gunshots coming from upstairs. He told deputies he then ran up to investigate and said he saw a vehicle leaving the area. According to testimony given later in court, this account did not match the physical evidence collected at the scene, and it changed multiple times as investigators pressed for more detail. Then Sheriff Mike Blakely and investigator Johnny Morrell led the interview with Mason on the night of the incident. Recorded footage of that interview was later shown to the jury. Investigators questioned him for an extended period about the inconsistencies in his story. According to that footage, Mason's account shifted several more times before he ultimately told investigators, "I did it." At that point, he did not provide further detail about the sequence of events. He was taken into custody. Because Alabama law does not allow a defendant under the age of majority to be held within the general adult population of a county jail, Mason was placed in a separate area of the Limestone County Jail while the investigation and the legal process moved forward, a process that would take years. Every homicide investigation depends on physical evidence, and this case was no exception. Let's walk through what investigators actually found and how forensic science was used to interpret it. A firearms examiner testified at trial regarding both the recovered weapon and physical evidence gathered at the scene. Gunshot residue analysis, a standard forensic technique used to estimate the distance between a firearm and a target at the moment it was fired, indicated that in at least one instance, the weapon had been discharged from a distance of approximately 1 foot. In several other instances, the estimated distance was approximately 3 feet. This kind of analysis doesn't just measure distance for its own sake. It helps investigators reconstruct the physical layout and sequence of events inside a scene, using measurable science rather than assumption. The medical examiner confirmed during testimony that each of the 5 victims died from gunshot wounds to the head. As stated, this channel does not go beyond that level of detail for any victim, adult or child. The defense used forensic evidence differently. Attorney Shea Golden pointed out during pretrial hearings that no gunshot residue was detected on Mason's hands at the time of his arrest, a detail the defense used to challenge the reliability of the confession obtained hours earlier. This is an important reminder about how forensic evidence works in a real courtroom. The same category of evidence can be used by both sides, interpreted through different arguments, and it's ultimately up to the jury to weigh it. Then there was the digital evidence, and this is where the case took an unusual turn. Investigators recovered Mary Sisk's cell phone from the scene, but it took approximately 3 years for forensic specialists, working with assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to unlock and extract its data. Modern smartphones use encryption that can make devices extremely difficult to access without the owner's credentials, even for law enforcement with a valid warrant. In this case, that technical barrier ended up reshaping the entire course of the prosecution, which we'll get to shortly. Investigators also introduced text messages Mason exchanged with a former girlfriend while he was being held in custody, sent through a monitored communication device used within the detention facility. In those messages, Mason described his involvement in the deaths of his family members, but gave an account that differed from what he told investigators the night of the incident, this time claiming he had been forced to act by another person. The defense would later argue that Mason, as a minor, could not legally consent to the terms of that communication device, and had not been properly informed the messages were being recorded for potential use by prosecutors. Between the incident and the first trial, several years passed. Part of that delay came from the nationwide public health emergency that began in 2020, which slowed court proceedings across the country. Part of it came from the ongoing effort to extract data from Mary Sisk's phone. In February of 2021, Mason was formally charged with capital murder involving 2 or more victims, along with 3 additional counts of capital murder involving a victim under the age of 14. Under Alabama law, capital murder charges apply to homicide cases involving specific aggravating factors. In this case, multiple victims and victims under a certain age, and they carry the state's most severe potential penalties. The case finally went to trial in September of 2022, but it did not reach a verdict. Circuit Judge Chadwick Wise declared a mistrial after new forensic reports connected to Mary Sisk's now unlocked cell phone were delivered to the court in the closing stages of the proceeding, arriving so close to jury deliberations that the court determined the trial could not proceed fairly for either side. It's worth pausing here to explain what a mistrial actually means, because it's frequently misunderstood. A mistrial is not an acquittal. It is not a conviction. It's a procedural outcome that occurs when a trial cannot be completed fairly, whether due to a hung jury, a legal error, or, as in this case, newly available evidence that could not be properly incorporated into the existing proceeding. When a mistrial is declared, the case does not end. It simply starts over, and both sides begin building their arguments again from the start. The retrial began in April of 2023, again before Judge Chadwick Wise. By this point, Mason was approximately 18 years old. In the pretrial hearings leading up to the retrial, both sides filed extensive motions about what evidence the jury would be allowed to hear. District Attorney Brian Jones and Assistant District Attorney Bill Lisenby, representing the prosecution, sought to keep testimony about family discord and alleged drug involvement by John Sisk out of the trial, arguing it had no direct bearing on the killings. The defense, led by attorneys Shay Golden and Michael Sizemore, pushed in the opposite direction. They sought to introduce expert testimony on coercive interrogation techniques, testimony intended to explain, in general terms, how sustained questioning by adult investigators can affect a 14-year-old's statements. They also sought to introduce an alternate suspect theory involving a family member, along with testimony about a paternity question involving one of the youngest victims. The court ultimately excluded several of these lines of argument from the jury's consideration, rulings the defense would later challenge on appeal. During the trial, the prosecution built its case around the forensic evidence we've already covered, the body camera footage, the recorded confession, and testimony establishing that Mason had prior experience with firearms, including time spent at a shooting range. The defense did not call any witnesses and rested without presenting an affirmative case. Instead, in closing arguments, the defense focused entirely on undermining the reliability of Mason's recorded statements, arguing they were the product of prolonged, high-pressure questioning of a minor, and on challenging the physical plausibility of the state's timeline, arguing it was unlikely one person could have caused the deaths of 5 people in a matter of seconds without waking anyone in the process. On April 27, 2023, the jury reached its verdict, guilty on 4 counts of capital murder. Because Mason was 14 years old, a minor, at the time of the offense, the death penalty was never a legally available option in this case. That's not a matter of prosecutorial discretion. It's a matter of constitutional law. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that the death penalty cannot be applied to anyone who was under the age of 18 at the time of their offense. Then, in 2012, in Miller v. Alabama, a case that, notably, originated in this same state, the Supreme Court went further, ruling that mandatory sentences of life without parole for juvenile offenders are unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Under that precedent, a sentencing judge cannot simply apply an automatic life without parole sentence to a juvenile defendant. The judge must individually evaluate the offender's age, maturity, and capacity for rehabilitation before deciding whether that sentence is appropriate. That meant Judge Wise had 2 sentencing options available to him: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, or life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after a minimum of 30 years served. On September 7, 2023, Judge Wise sentenced Mason Sisk to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In his written order, the judge stated that he considered this case to be among the rare circumstances in which the harshest available sentence remained appropriate for a juvenile offender, citing the number of victims involved and the fact that the victims were in their beds at the time of the offense. Mason Sisk is currently serving that sentence at Kilby Correctional Facility in Montgomery, Alabama. The case did not end with sentencing. In October of 2023, Mason's defense team filed a motion requesting a new trial. Their argument rested on several grounds: that the court should have allowed testimony on coercive interrogation, that it should have allowed the alternate suspect and family circumstance testimony, and that Mason's statements to investigators should have been suppressed entirely, given that he was questioned for extended periods without being read his rights, and without an adult present on his behalf. The prosecution responded that the defense had not raised any new legal argument that would justify reversing the court's earlier decisions. On December 1, 2023, Judge Wise denied the motion in a brief written order. The defense then filed a formal appeal with the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals in December of 2023. In a 17-page written opinion, the appellate court upheld the conviction, finding no reversible legal error in the trial court's rulings. This stage of the case is a useful illustration of how the American appellate system actually functions. An appeal is not a retrial. It doesn't re-examine the facts or reweigh the evidence the jury already considered. It asks a narrower legal question: Did the trial court make an error significant enough to have affected the outcome? Appellate courts generally give considerable deference to a trial judge's rulings on what evidence is admissible, unless a clear and material legal error can be shown. In this case, the appellate court found none, and the conviction stood. Beyond the specific facts, this case sits at the intersection of several important developments in American criminal law, and that's part of why it continues to be studied by legal observers. First, it's a direct application of the Miller v. Alabama framework in practice. Judge Wise's sentencing order didn't just impose a sentence. It had to explicitly engage with the constitutional requirement to weigh Mason's age and circumstances before determining that life, without parole, was still warranted. That written reasoning is exactly the kind of individualized analysis the Supreme Court required when it struck down mandatory juvenile life sentences more than a decade ago. Second, the case highlights just how central digital forensics has become to modern homicide investigations. A single locked cell phone delayed a major capital murder trial for years, triggered a mistrial after new data surfaced at the worst possible moment for the timeline, and ultimately shaped the state's case in ways that couldn't have existed in an investigation from a generation earlier. As encryption technology becomes more advanced, this kind of extended digital forensic effort is becoming increasingly common in cases across the country, not just this one. Third, the case raises ongoing legal questions specific to juvenile interrogation. How long can a minor be questioned before that questioning becomes coercive? What protections should be in place when a 14-year-old is being interviewed by adult law enforcement without a guardian present? These questions were central to the defense's strategy throughout both trials and the appeal, and they remain actively debated in courts and legislatures across the country. The case of Mason Sisk stands as one of the most extensively litigated juvenile homicide prosecutions in Alabama's recent history, spanning nearly 4 years, 2 separate trials, a multi-year digital forensics effort, and a full round of appellate review before reaching its current legal conclusion. As of this recording, Mason Sisk remains incarcerated at Kilby Correctional Facility, serving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, following the exhaustion of his direct appeal. Thank you for watching this documented account on cold justice. If this case helped you understand how forensic science, digital evidence, and constitutional law intersect in prosecutions involving juvenile defendants, take a moment to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Cold Justice. New documented cases are released regularly.